How dare you even come in here dressed like that? The waiter's sneering voice echoed through the upscale New York City restaurant, turning heads as Patricia Taylor, visibly flustered, clutched her modest purse and fought back tears. Little did he know, the woman he'd just humiliated was the mother of Keanu Reeves, the Hollywood legend watching quietly from the shadows. What unfolded next would leave the entire room speechless and flip the script in a way no one could predict. Before we dive into this incredible tale, drop a comment letting us know where you're joining us from. If you love captivating stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, we've got another unforgettable story lined up for you. How dare you even step foot in here looking like that? The sharp, contemptuous voice of Jacques, the head waiter at L'Étoile d'Or, cut through the hum of the upscale Manhattan restaurant like a knife. Patricia Taylor, a soft-spoken woman in her early 70s, froze mid-step, her worn wool coat hanging loosely over her frame and her sensible shoes scuffing the polished floor. She'd come alone tonight, hoping for a quiet dinner to celebrate her birthday. No fuss, no fanfare, just a warm meal at a place she'd heard was special. She hadn't made a reservation, figuring a Tuesday evening wouldn't be too busy. But now, standing under Jacques' withering gaze, she felt every bit the outsider he clearly thought she was. Patricia clutched her modest purse tighter, her fingers trembling slightly. She wasn't one for makeup or jewelry, never had been, and tonight was no exception. Her gray hair was pulled back neatly, her face lined with years of hard work and quiet resilience. She'd raised a family, stitched costumes for Hollywood films, and survived more than most would guess. But none of that mattered to Jacques. To him, she was just an old woman in a faded coat, unworthy of the gleaming chandeliers and crisp white tablecloths of L'Étoile d'Or. "We don't serve people who don't meet our standards," Jacques said, his tone dripping with disdain as he looked her up and down. He was a wiry man in his 50s, his slicked-back hair and tailored vest screaming self-importance. His lips curled into a smirk, and he raised his voice just enough to draw attention from the nearby tables. A couple in expensive suits glanced over, whispering to each other. A woman with a pearl necklace arched an eyebrow, her expression a mix of curiosity and judgment. Patricia's cheeks flushed, the heat rising despite the chill she'd carried in from the winter night outside. I didn't mean to cause trouble," Patricia began, her voice soft and unsteady. "I just wanted to have dinner. It's my birthday and I thought—" Jacques cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Your birthday? Please. This isn't some diner down the street where you can waltz in looking like you just rolled out of a thrift store. L'Étoile d'Or has a reputation to uphold." His words landed like a slap, and Patricia flinched, her eyes stinging with the threat of tears. She wasn't used to this. Sure, she'd faced her share of hard looks and whispered judgments over the years, especially back when she was a single mother scraping by. But this was different. This was cruel, deliberate, and loud enough for everyone to hear when she was a single mother scraping by. But this was different. This was cruel, deliberate, and loud enough for everyone to hear. The other diners shifted uncomfortably, some pretending not to notice, others openly staring. A man in a pinstripe suit chuckled under his breath, muttering something to his date about standards. Patricia swallowed hard, her throat tight. She didn't want a scene. She didn't need anyone's pity. All she'd wanted was a warm plate of food and a moment to feel good about making it to another year. Now she just wanted to disappear. "Do you even know where you are?" Jacques pressed, stepping closer, his voice rising with theatrical flair. "This is Manhattan's finest. We cater to people who belong here, not charity cases who can't even dress the part." He gestured at her coat like it was an offense to his very existence, his smirk widening as a few more heads turned. Patricia's hands shook as she gripped her purse, her knuckles whitening. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? That she'd worked her whole life to give her kids a better one? That she didn't care about fancy clothes because she'd learned long ago what really mattered? None of that would mean a thing to this man. "I'm sorry," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll go. I didn't mean to." "Oh, don't apologize," Jacques interrupted, his tone mocking now. "Just leave. Save us all the trouble." He crossed his arms, standing like a gatekeeper, daring her to argue. The room seemed to close in around her, the murmurs of the other guests buzzing in her ears. She took a step back, ready to turn tail and flee into the cold night, when a flicker of defiance sparked in her chest. She wouldn't let this man ruin her night. Not completely. "I'll wait," she said, louder this time, though her voice still wavered. "If there's a table free, I'd like to stay." Jacques laughed, a short, harsh sound that made her stomach twist. "Wait! You? Suit yourself, but don't expect me to roll out the red carpet." He turned away, muttering something to a nearby server that drew a snicker. Patricia stood there, alone and exposed, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She didn't know it yet, but someone else had been watching. Someone who wouldn't let this end the way Jacques expected. Patricia stood her ground, her frail frame trembling but resolute, as Jacques' mocking laughter faded into the murmur of the restaurant. The air at l'Étoile d'Or felt thick with tension, the other diners' eyes darting between her and the head waiter like spectators at a showdown. She clutched her purse tighter, her quiet defiance hanging in the silence that followed. Jacques rolled his eyes, turning away as if she were beneath his notice, but the damage was done. His words had left a sting she couldn't shake. Still, she wouldn't run. Not yet. At the edge of the dining room, a young waitress named Sophie watched the scene unfold with a growing knot in her stomach. She was new here, barely a week into the job, and already she'd seen Jacques wield his authority like a weapon. At 23, with wide eyes and a nervous habit of tucking her dark hair behind her ear, Sophie hadn't signed up for this. She'd taken the gig at l'Étoile d'Or, hoping to save up for school, not to stand by while an old woman got humiliated. Something about Patricia, the way she held herself despite the insults, reminded Sophie of her own grandmother, who'd raised her on a shoestring budget and a surplus of grit. Sophie stepped forward, her tray balanced carefully in one hand. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice cutting through the lingering echoes of Jacques' outburst. She glanced at Patricia, offering a small, tentative smile. "I can check if there's a spot in the back. It's quieter there, maybe more comfortable." Her words were gentle, a lifeline tossed into the storm Jacques had whipped up. Patricia looked up, startled but grateful. "Oh, thank you," she said, her voice still shaky but warm. "I'd appreciate that." Jacques spun around, his smirk vanishing as he caught Sophie's offer. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped, his tone venomous enough to make Sophie flinch. He strode over, towering over her despite his wiry build. "We don't shuffle tables around for strays. She's not eating here. End of story." He jabbed a finger toward Patricia, his voice rising again. "Look at her. She's a beggar in a coat, not a guest. Tell her to leave, Sophie, or I'll have you mopping floors instead of waiting tables." Sophie's cheeks burned, her hands tightening on the tray. She opened her mouth to argue, but Jacques didn't give her the chance. "Out!" he barked at Patricia, loud enough to make a nearby couple jump. "You're wasting everyone's time. Go beg somewhere else." The word beg landed like a punch, and Patricia's shoulders slumped, the fight in her flickering. She didn't cry. Years of toughness had taught her to hold tears back, but the hurt was plain in her eyes. "I'm not begging," Patricia said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'll wait. If there's a table free, I'd be grateful to have it." She met Jacques' gaze, refusing to crumble completely. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make his smirk falter for a split second. The room buzzed with reaction. A man in a sleek gray suit leaned toward his companion, muttering, "She's got nerve, I'll give her that." His date nodded, smirking. "Nerve, sure, but she doesn't belong here." Across the room, a woman in a red dress frowned, her fork hovering over her plate. "He didn't have to be so harsh," she whispered to her husband, who shrugged. "Rules are rules." The divide was clear. Some saw Patricia as an intruder, others as a victim, but no one moved to help. They were content to watch, their murmurs a low hum under the clink of glasses and silverware. Sophie hesitated, caught between Jacques' glare and Patricia's quiet plea. She took a step toward the back, determined to find a solution, but Jacques grabbed her arm. "Don't you dare!" he hissed. "You're on thin ice, kid. Get back to your station." Sophie yanked her arm free, her jaw tightening, but she didn't push further. Not yet. She shot Patricia an apologetic look, her eyes saying what her voice couldn't. "I'm sorry." Patricia nodded faintly, understanding. She wasn't angry at the girl. She could see Sophie was trying. But Jacques? He was another story. His cruelty gnawed at her, stirring memories of harder days, times when she'd been judged for less, dismissed for what she lacked instead of what she'd built. She straightened her spine, deciding she'd wait as long as it took. If they wouldn't seat her, she'd leave on her own terms, not his. Unbeknownst to her, someone else had been watching the whole time. Near the bar, a man in a black leather jacket and sunglasses sat nursing a glass of water, his posture casual but his attention razor-sharp. Long hair peeked out from under a beanie, and his boots rested lightly on the floor, ready to move. It was Keanu Reeves, her son, here for a reason Jacques couldn't have dreamed of. He'd planned to surprise Patricia tonight, to celebrate her birthday in style at l'Étoile d'Or. She didn't know he was in town, let alone waiting to meet her here. He'd slipped in early, keeping a low profile, wanting the moment to be perfect. But now, as he watched Jacques tear into his mother, Keanu's hands tightened around his glass. His jaw clenched, a quiet fury building behind his calm exterior. He'd seen plenty of arrogance in his life. Hollywood was full of it. But this was personal. This was his mom, the woman who'd worked late nights sewing costumes so he could eat, who'd taught him kindness when the world offered none. He stayed still for now, letting the scene play out, but his eyes never left her. Patricia didn't know it yet, but she wasn't alone, and Jacques was about to learn that the hard way. The tension in the room thickened, a storm brewing beneath the surface. Sophie hovered near the edge of the dining area, torn between duty and decency. The other diners whispered, their voices a chorus of judgment and curiosity. Patricia stood firm, her dignity battered but intact. And Keanu waited, his presence a silent promise that this wouldn't end with his mother walking out defeated. Something was coming, something Jacques wouldn't see until it hit him square in the face. Jacques' voice rang out again, sharp and unrelenting, as he leaned closer to Patricia with a sneer. You think standing there like a lost puppy changes anything? This isn't a shelter. You're not getting a handout here. His words dripped with venom, each one designed to cut deeper, and Patricia's hands tightened around her purse, her resolve wavering under the weight of his cruelty. Sophie lingered nearby, her tray shaking slightly as she glanced between them, helpless but seething. The other diners watched, some smirking, others shifting uncomfortably, but none stepping in. The air at L'Etoile d'Or crackled with unease, the tension coiling tighter by the second. Then, a shadow moved from the bar. The man in the black leather jacket stood, his boots clicking softly against the floor as he pulled off his sunglasses with a slow, deliberate motion. Long hair fell loose from his beanie, framing a face that needed no introduction. Keanu Reeves stepped forward, his presence quiet but commanding, cutting through the buzz of the room like a blade. He didn't rush, didn't shout. There was no need. The weight of who he was filled the space before he even spoke. "Mom," he said, his voice low and steady, but carrying an unmistakable strength. He stopped beside Patricia, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. The word hung in the air, simple yet seismic, and the restaurant fell silent. Forks clattered against plates. A glass tipped over, forgotten. Every eye turned to the pair, Patricia, small and unassuming in her faded coat, and Keanu, the Hollywood icon, standing tall beside her. Patricia's head snapped up, her eyes widening. "Keanu?" she whispered, confusion and relief warring in her voice. She hadn't expected him here. Not tonight, not like this. Her birthday surprise had been his idea, but she'd thought he was still across the country, busy with his life. Now, seeing him, her breath caught, a mix of gratitude and dread washing over her. She didn't want a scene, not for her sake. Jacques froze, his smirk vanishing as recognition hit. His face drained of color, leaving him pale and slack-jawed. He blinked rapidly, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Keanu's piercing gaze. Sir?" he stammered, his voice suddenly small. "I didn't know she was... I was just following the rules." He straightened, trying to salvage his dignity, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. He gestured vaguely toward Patricia, as if that explained everything. Keanu's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "Rules," he said, his tone measured but edged with steel. "What rule says you can insult an elderly woman just because of how she's dressed?" He stepped closer, his height and quiet intensity making Jacques shrink back instinctively. "You didn't ask her name. You didn't ask why she's here. You just decided she wasn't good enough." His words weren't loud, but they carried, each one landing like a stone in the hushed room. Patricia tugged at his sleeve, her voice barely audible. "Keanu, please, don't make a fuss. I'm fine. I don't need this." Her eyes darted around, taking in the staring faces, the whispers starting to ripple again. She hated being the center of attention, hated the idea of her son fighting her battles. She'd spent her life handling worse than this on her own. Judgmental landlords, snide bosses, the endless grind of making ends meet. She could walk away from Jacques and still hold her head high. But Keanu didn't budge. He turned to her, his expression softening for a moment as he squeezed her shoulder. "You're not fine, Mom," he said gently, "and I'm not letting this go." Then he faced Jacques again, his voice rising just enough to silence the murmurs. "She deserves more respect than anyone in this room, not because of who I am, because of who she is." He didn't yell. Didn't need to. The conviction in his words was enough to make the air feel heavier, the truth of them sinking into everyone listening. Jacques opened his mouth, then closed it, floundering. If I'd known she was with you, I wouldn't have... He started, but Keanu cut him off, his voice sharp now. With me? Keanu said, stepping forward again, close enough that Jacques took a shaky step back. She doesn't need to be with anyone to matter. She's a person, not a status symbol. That should have been enough for you. His eyes locked onto Jacques's, unyielding, and for the first time, the head waiter looked genuinely rattled. He glanced around, seeking support from the other diners, but found none. The man in the suit who'd chuckled earlier now stared at his plate. The woman in the red dress watched with quiet approval, her husband nodding faintly beside her. Patricia's hand found Keanu's arm, her touch light but firm. Keanu, she said, louder this time, let's just go. I don't want to stay where I'm not welcome. Her voice wavered, but there was strength beneath it, years of resilience shining through. She didn't need Jacques' approval or anyone else's. She just wanted to leave with her dignity intact. Keanu hesitated, his gaze still fixed on Jacques. He wasn't the type to explode, never had been. Anger didn't come naturally to him, but this was different. This was his mother, the woman who'd given him everything, standing here humiliated by a man too small to see her worth. He took a slow breath, forcing the tension out of his shoulders, and turned back to her. Okay, Mom, he said softly, if that's what you want. But the look he shot Jacques promised this wasn't over. Not yet. The room remained silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Sophie stood frozen, her tray still clutched tightly, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and relief. The other diners watched, some ashamed, some captivated, as Keanu slid an arm around Patricia's shoulders, shielding her from the stares. Jacques stood there, diminished, his authority stripped away in front of the very people he'd tried to impress. As Keanu guided Patricia toward the door, her small frame leaning into his steady presence, the restaurant held its breath. They hadn't left yet, but the tide had turned. Jacques had misjudged, and Keanu had made it clear. Family, dignity, humanity, those mattered more than any dress code or pretentious rule. What came next would depend on what Keanu decided to do with the fire still simmering in his chest, and Patricia's quiet strength guiding him forward. Keanu's arm stayed steady around Patricia's shoulders as they took a step toward the door of L'Étoile d'Or, the silence of the restaurant pressing in around them. Jacques stood rooted to the spot, his face a mask of shock and crumbling arrogance, while Sophie hovered nearby, her eyes still wide with the weight of what she'd just witnessed. The other diners watched, holding their breath, expecting the pair to vanish into the Manhattan night. Another story of quiet defeat or petty triumph, depending on who you asked. But Keanu stopped short, his boots scuffing the floor as he turned back, his gaze sweeping the room. He looked at Sophie, the young waitress who'd tried to help, and his expression softened. "Hey," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made her straighten. "What's your name?" "Sophie," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, caught off guard by the question. She clutched her tray tighter, as if it could shield her from the sudden attention. Keanu nodded, then asked, "Do you want to run this place?" The question hung in the air, absurd and surreal. Sophie blinked, her mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. Jacques let out a harsh, incredulous laugh, breaking the silence. "Run it? Her?" he scoffed, folding his arms as if Keanu had just told a bad joke. She can barely handle a tray, let alone a restaurant like this. His smirk returned, weaker now, but still clinging to the idea that he held some control. Keanu didn't flinch. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, tapped the screen a few times, and held it to his ear. The room watched, confused, as he spoke in a low, clipped tone. "Yeah, it's me. We're good to go. Finalize it, 24 hours. He hung up, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and met Jacques' gaze with a faint, unreadable smile. "I just bought this place," he said simply. "Papers will be done by tomorrow morning." A gasp rippled through the diners. Sophie's tray slipped an inch in her hands, her eyes darting between Keanu and Patricia. Jacques' smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed stare, his mind scrambling to catch up. What?" he sputtered, his voice cracking. "You can't just—" "I can," Keanu cut in, his tone flat but final. "The owner's an old friend. Been talking about selling for a while. I figured tonight was the right time to make it official." He glanced at Patricia, his eyes softening again. "It was supposed to be a birthday gift for my mom, something special. But I didn't expect to find her getting treated like this." Patricia's hand tightened on his arm, her brow furrowing. "Keanu, what are you doing?" she murmured, her voice a mix of worry and disbelief. She hadn't asked for this, any of it. She just wanted to leave, to escape the humiliation and find somewhere quiet. But Keanu wasn't finished. He turned back to Sophie. "You're the new manager," he said, his voice steady. "Starting now." Then he looked at Jacques, his expression hardening. "And you're done. Pack your stuff and get out. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here." Jacques stumbled back a step, his face flushing red. "You can't fire me," he barked, desperation creeping in. "I've been here for years. I run this place." His hands flailed, grasping for authority that was slipping through his fingers. "You ran it into the ground," Keanu shot back. "You don't treat people like that and call it standards. You're gone." His words were quiet, but carried the force of a hammer, leaving no room for argument. The diners murmured again, some nodding in approval, others still too stunned to react. Sophie stood frozen, her mind reeling, while Jacques' protests died in his throat. His bravado shattered. But then came the real twist, the one no one saw coming. Patricia stepped forward, her small frame drawing every eye in the room. "Keanu?" she said, her voice stronger now, cutting through the chaos. "Stop. I don't want this." Keanu turned to her, surprised. "Mom? It's yours. I did this for you. You deserve it." Patricia shook her head, her gray hair catching the light as she looked up at him. "I don't want to own this place," she said firmly. "I don't need a restaurant or a title or anything like that. What I want, what I've always wanted, is for people to be treated with kindness. That's it." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room, taking in the stunned faces, the whispers, the tension. "If you're serious about this, then don't give it to me. Change it." "Change it," Keanu echoed, his brow furrowing. "Yes," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Make it a place where no one gets turned away because of how they look or what they wear. No dress codes, no judging, just good food and respect. Train the staff, the ones who stay, to see people for who they are, not what they have. That's the gift I'd want, Keanu. Not ownership, a community." For a moment, Keanu just stared at her, the fire in his chest shifting into something quieter, deeper. Then he nodded, a slow smile breaking through. "Okay, Mom, he said. We'll do it your way. He turned to Sophie, who still looked like she might faint. You're still in charge. You up for making this happen? Sophie swallowed hard, then nodded. Yes, sir, I can do that. Good, Keanu said. He glanced at Jacques one last time. You heard her. Get out. Jacques hesitated, then grabbed his coat from behind the counter and stormed off, muttering under his breath as he disappeared through the back. The room exhaled, the tension breaking like a wave. A week later, L'Étoile d'Or was unrecognizable. The chandeliers stayed, but the air of exclusivity was gone. Tables filled with people from every walk of life. Businessmen in suits, students in hoodies, retirees in cardigans, all laughing, eating, sharing stories. The staff, retrained under Sophie's nervous but determined leadership, greeted everyone with warmth. No one asked about dress codes or reservations. The menu still had its fancy dishes, but now it included affordable options too, scribbled on a chalkboard by the door. That night, Patricia sat at a corner table, a small chocolate cake in front of her, her belated birthday treat. Keanu sat across from her, his jacket draped over the chair, a grin on his face as he watched the room. Around them, strangers raised glasses, toasting her not just for the day she was born, but for what she'd inspired. A man in a worn jacket clinked his mug with a woman in pearls. A kid in sneakers waved at Sophie, who waved back, her tray long gone. Patricia cut the cake, her hands steady now, and handed Keanu a slice. You didn't have to do all this, she said softly, her eyes glistening. Yeah, I did, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. You taught me what matters, Mom. It's just me giving it back. She smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks, and the room erupted in cheers, unscripted, unpolished, real. L'Étoile d'Or wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was Patricia's legacy, a place where kindness trumped everything else, and no one, not even Jacques, could have predicted that. The story of Patricia Taylor and Keanu Reeves at L'Étoile d'Or teaches us a profound lesson. True worth lies not in appearances or status, but in how we treat one another. Patricia's quiet strength and Keanu's unwavering support turned a moment of humiliation into a movement of compassion, proving that kindness can reshape even the most rigid spaces. In our daily lives, this reminds us to look beyond the surface, whether it's the cashier in worn shoes or the stranger in line, and offer respect instead of judgment. Small acts of decency can ripple outward, just as they did here, transforming a single night into a legacy. So what's one way you've shown or received kindness lately? Drop it in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. And if this tale moved you, share it with someone who inspires you to be better every day.